science,
engineering,
medicine,
chemistry,
physics,
biology, humanities, cardiology,
computing, public health, global
science communication.
Hello everyone, I'm Gareth Mitchell. Today, lots on the climate for you as COP26 approaches. We're discussing climate injustice for those countries that have polluted the least but are being affected the most. Also on the menu, the climate crisis and mental health. We're showcasing the upcoming Great Exhibition Road Festival and hearing about the exotic world of quantum computing with one of our physics professors.
We're very excited by our approach. We feel that it's got a very good chance of being the first approach to build a really large-scale quantum computer.
The Imperial College Podcast.
All right, folks, well, let's jump straight in, as we always do, with a couple of quick news stories from around the college. And we're going to start with Kat Peterson, who's campaign manager at the Grantham Institute. And, of course, a massive and really important autumn coming up with COP26. That's in November. And, Kat, from the Grantham Institute side of things, what can you tell us about Imperial's big objectives and activities around COP?
Well, so in particular, we're going to be focusing on how to accelerate decarbonisation of transport and the transport sector as part of achieving net zero emissions, but also there's links between biodiversity and the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, and sort of the importance of thinking around some of these two issues as interlinked. So we're going to be hosting events and publishing briefings and doing various kinds of public engagement around some of these issues as well. Another really important objective for us is also around sort of collaborating with other universities and other education institutions in the UK to really maximise everything that we can do together. So we're going to be working with lots of different universities as part of the COP26 Universities Network, which we at Imperial run, to really kind of engage the UK public in talking about climate change and how we can all tackle it together.
Right, so you mentioned their big Imperial involvement this year, but that follows on from years of involvement then. So how has Imperial been involved in the past?
Well, yeah, exactly. Like you say, Imperial's always been really engaged with the COPs. So the last COP in Madrid in Spain, we focused a lot of work on the link between climate change and health issues like air pollution, and hosted an event with the UN on how countries can sort of integrate those two issues together, as obviously sort of public health is also something that we Imperial work a lot on. In 2018, at the COP in Poland, we sent a delegation of, I think, around 12 academics and students and communications professionals to COP as well, both to participate in and to sort of observe the negotiations. Imperial also had a delegation in Paris in 2015, which is obviously where the big Paris Agreement was signed, and the people from Imperial who spent their time sort of observing the negotiations and translating their meaning to media reporters and to social media and to people sort of back at home.
And of course, when we watch the COP conferences on the news, we're inevitably very aware of the high-level political stuff, and we see all the big press conferences with all the leaders, but it's hard to get an idea of what really goes on behind the scenes. So can you paint a picture of what COP is like, as it were, behind those things that we see on the news so often?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It all looks like a sort of big kind of glitzy conference with lots of world leaders. And of course it is that. It is first and foremost that sort of major diplomatic kind of negotiation. But beyond those negotiations, COP is also really a sort of major opportunity for loads of other types of organizations and local groups to make their voice heard on climate change and what they want to do to tackle it. COP's always filled with sort of indigenous groups, faith groups, businesses, and so on. Lots of organizations that use it as a moment to raise awareness of climate change. And Glasgow, as the city itself, will probably also host quite a few events and also be kind of the sort of a bit of a global stage for stunts and marches and protests and things like that. So it should be a really lively experience for the Imperial delegation and everyone else who goes in November.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Kat Peterson. I know you're going to have a really busy time leading up to and then indeed at the COP26. Now, closer to home, we have the Great Exhibition Road Festival. It's returning, I'm very delighted to say, next month in October. And we're going to hear more now from Joe Childs, who's one of the organisers, very much at the forefront. And Joe, you're with the public engagement team at Imperial. So tell me about the festival.
Yep. So we're really excited to be returning this year. The Great Exhibition Road Festival is the celebration of science and the arts with 3 events for all ages. From the 9th to the 15th of October, we'll be exploring the theme of One World, And we're going to be looking at how science and the arts can help inspire a greener future for the planet that we share.
Yeah, and we've literally just been talking about COP26, so it's very much on the agenda for us all here at Imperial and beyond. So what do we need to know about the festival? For one thing, is it actually going to be an in situ event at long last, a physical event?
Yes, so we will be having events in South Kensington, as well as events that will be live streamed from South Kensington online and additional online events, so people can enjoy a bit of the festival from wherever they are. But we are very excited to be returning to London as well. It gives people a wonderful opportunity to meet the scientists, artists, designers, and innovators who are actually working to find solutions to the climate emergency. As with the 2019 festival, in collaboration with iconic museums, culture, and research organisations based in and around Exhibition Road.
What about some of the highlights on the programme? Are there things that you're especially looking forward to then, Jo?
Yes, so we've got a brilliant programme this year. There's a wonderful mix of creative hands-on workshops for families and adults, loads of inspiring talks, and things like immersive shows as well. So you could do everything from upcycling sort of waste materials and bringing new life to these, or you could explore some of the incredible habitats that are currently at risk, including our oceans, but also the rainforests of Costa Rica. You can also go to many of our talks, like eco-anxiety is one area that we are exploring, and how the fight to save our planet can actually improve our own individual and collective well-being, and the importance of connecting with nature in our own lives.
So finally then, Jo, how can people find out about it and book themselves in for any of the events?
So to find out more, people should visit the festival website at www.greatexhibitionroadfestival.co.uk. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook at xroadfestival, and you'll be able to see the full programme and everything we're up to there.
So that's where to get the details. Jo Childs, thank you very much indeed for that exciting preview of the forthcoming Great Exhibition Road Festival. And one of the topics up for discussion at the festival will be how to deal with climate injustice. Mitigating the climate crisis is a big enough challenge for rich nations. But for those that are poorer, the issues really are daunting. They're often the places most affected by warming and sea level rises, the least financially equipped to deal with the crisis, and have often historically polluted less in the first place. I've been speaking to two experts, one who sees the solution partially in new architectures and the other in new models of finance. And guess what? There's a commonality here. Both of these guests see it as a design problem at the end of the day. Christina Geros is a tutor in the Environmental Architecture programme at the Royal College of Art in London, and one of her regions of interest is Southeast Asia. We'll hear from her and we'll discuss Indonesia. But first, Courtney Bailey, who's a Commonwealth PhD scholar at Imperial, researching climate investment, specifically in the Eastern Caribbean small island developing states.
So my research is looking at climate change adaptation financing specifically, trying to figure out ways in which we can increase private investment for adaptation planning, specifically infrastructure projects. So that's what my work entails, and trying to see, using the conditions of the Eastern Caribbean, how we can increase such investment.
Yeah, sure. So, Christina, for your part, you're an architect, you're a landscape architect and an urban designer, and indeed a lecturer. And you're very interested too in specific design. In other words, design and architecture that is sensitive to communities. So where does that lead you in terms of climate justice and how it affects maybe the buildings and the landscapes in which we all live?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of the work that I've been doing most recently that's been focused in Southeast Asia tries to tackle the problem that is how global green initiatives are sort of launched in the global South, I suppose, though I hate to use that term. In the South, they're often sort of predicated on the need to take away control of natural resources from local populations. Often it's a mix of external actors collaborating with multinational companies and foreign private sector actors along with the national governments of places like Indonesia. So then trying to sort of figure out ways to use design to help these local populations to exercise control again over those natural resources, to reestablish management regimes, rights to land and rights to humane conditions of living.
So, Courtney, that brings us back to you, because Indonesia, of course, is an enormous country. It's an archipelago country, but it's enormous. You're talking about these small island developing states in the Eastern Caribbean. From what you've heard from Christina, where she talks about an approach that involves design, not necessarily design-led, but certainly empowering communities through design, does that sound interesting to you or familiar to you as maybe part of what could help communities in the Eastern Caribbean?
Yeah, most definitely. I think design is critical, not just from just a climate change perspective, but if we take a step back or forward and look at it from a sustainability perspective, and a lot of climate change adaptation revolves around infrastructure, and design is the center or the core of that. What's important is that we have the correct data to inform that design. We have climate modeling, etc., and from that we understand what some of those risks are, and then the next step is how do we design not just hard infrastructure projects, but how do we design programs so that, one, they're climate resilient, and two, that they support sustainable development. But also from the standpoint of financing, how you design the project is going to determine how attractive it is to investors, how willing they are to invest in a project based on the risks, based on the design, and completely agree that design is essential.
And as you point out there, Courtney, design and finance are inevitably interlinked.
Yes.
And then I guess we need benchmarks against which to judge the resilience of programs and projects to mitigate climate change. And to you, those benchmarks include the Sustainable Development Goals, don't they? The UN SDGs. So how does that happen?
Yes, the SDGs they're very broad still, but they present a good framework against which we can start benchmarking progress. It captures every element of sustainable development, society, economy, and the environment. And when we are designing anything, design comes back into play, it's important that we take these three areas into account. So we have no poverty, zero hunger as a goal. So those are benchmarks when we're, for example, in adaptation, we can say, okay, does this project help to alleviate poverty, or would it exacerbate poverty in a certain area? What about hunger? When we talk about hunger, we start talking about agriculture and sustainable agriculture and climate resilience and those things. And then we go down to the later goals, and we have life on land and life below water. So when we develop projects, for example, coastal projects, coastal defense and resilience projects, we need to start thinking about the ecosystems that are being affected there. So yes, that's why in my work I'm using the SDGs as a benchmark as well for how good we're doing or what we need to do.
So, Christina, I suppose design comes in so many different forms, and it's very easy to immediately think of it, it's just about architecture, it's about what the buildings look like. But this is social design, urban design, maybe even the design of finance in many ways. Give me a sense of the breadth of what we mean by design and how that's relevant to mitigating climate injustice, where you spend a lot of your time.
I think all of what Courtney just said is true. It's all very important. I think the SDGs that are laid out in the IPC report are important benchmarks, but they only kind of tackle certain aspects of what the built environment is. Yeah. You know, thinking about the design of economies or how economies are playing out, we need to rethink what is valued and how it's valued. And that has to be part of the design process. Like, we can't talk about sustainable architecture as just technological and material innovations and formal gestures towards passive systems, etc. Like, we have to talk about that in terms of a total recall about what we value and how we value it. That has to be actually at the core of sustainable design.
I really like the point where Christina talked about what value is. It's about, when we talk about climate justice, it's about meeting the needs of the people who are there and making sure that whatever policies, plans, designs that we do it's not harming them in a way, but, positioning them to utilize their resources in a sustainable way. Yes, we're moving toward low carbon, climate resilient development, but we have, arguments of culture, etc. How do we capture what they value, and how do we develop and design projects, etc. around them? So I just wanted to add that and say I completely agree with that point.
Courtney Bailey and Christina Geros, both of whom will be discussing that topic in even greater depth at the forthcoming Great Exhibition Road Festival as they tackle the question, how can we ensure equality and basic human rights are preserved in the pursuit of saving the planet? It's all part of this year's One World theme. And guess what? I'm hosting the panel. See you there. More details about the festival via the website greatexhibitionroadfestival.co.uk. The climate crisis is unequivocally human-made. That's the gist of the IPCC's most damning report to date. And as forests burn, coastlines flood and harvests fail, the evidence mounts over climate change and its effect on our mental health. One of those studying the link is Dr. Emma Lawrence of the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial. And here's Caroline Brogan in conversation with Emma and finding out about the latest research.
Emma, thank you so much for joining me. Earlier in 2021, you released several studies addressing the link between the climate crisis and mental health, a link which you conclude to be chronically understudied. What were some other findings from your research?
Thanks, first of all, Caroline, for having me on. It's lovely to be back. So what we found is that there are ways that climate change directly impacts mental health. So, for example, those extreme weather events that are more frequent and severe with climate change, things like wildfires, floods, hurricanes, understandably are very traumatic. So there's a big mental health burden with extreme distress and more diagnoses of PTSD, anxiety and depression, and even higher suicide rates. And we often talk about loss of houses, loss of lives, understandably so, but we don't talk about the psychological burden, which has been estimated to be up to 40 times greater than, for a single disaster than the number of people affected by physical injury. We also found with rising temperatures and more frequent heat waves, increased suicide rates, more emergency visits to hospitals for mental disorders, and also worsened community mental health and well-being on days with higher temperatures or more extreme temperatures.
Looking back to the IPCC report, it's pretty damning and really worrying. What does your research say about dealing with these stark warnings in a way that's healthy?
It's a lot to take on, and so I think the thing that I would say first to remind the listeners, I'm not a clinician, but I've spoken to many mental health professionals who are sort of climate informed, are working with people who are experiencing distress. And the thing they really want to emphasize to people is that it's healthy to be worried about this. For some people, of course, though, it can become this sort of level of distress and anxiety and overwhelm can begin to affect their sleep or their relationships, their lives, to the point that it's really important to seek other help. It can be really, really beneficial to not feeling alone in what you're going through, to be able to talk to others. But if you are someone who feels angry, who feels, sometimes overwhelmed or anxious or guilty or fearful, or a whole range of strong emotions people report, they can be part of a normal, healthy response to what's going on. And it's important that we start to talk about these more as a society and see how we can then provide opportunities to shift people from this and into a place where they're able to sit with that, but also able to act. And so it's not overwhelming, and they have that sense of agency and that ability to contribute to the changes that they want to see. The future is still unwritten. There's a whole range of currently possible futures. So, for example, we know that air pollution affects in unequal ways poorer communities in our society, but raises the risk of things like schizophrenia and anxiety and depression. And so if we can address the cause of air pollution, we can improve air quality, address that inequality, and reduce mental health risk, while at the same time producing a safer climate future. And there's similar things with with access to green space and increasing biodiversity, providing more active transport that's easier, so improving the energy efficiency of housing, which takes people out of fuel poverty and also helps them not use so much heating and reduce their emissions, while also, again, addressing inequalities in current kind of housing standards and infrastructure. So there's opportunities, if we see this more holistically, to create a better future across numerous fronts simultaneously. And we have an opportunity here to really create a future that has a safer climate but is also mentally healthier.
What are you and the research community doing to address the research gap in the link between climate crisis and mental health crisis?
So what we've been doing is running a study called Changing Worlds with young people who are known to be particularly experiencing these sort of strong emotions and distress. We've been looking in that study at how young people are responding to both COVID-19 and climate change. And we've got a lot of interesting results from that, particularly that young people are actually more distressed and concerned around climate change than COVID, even when we collected the data in 2020. And in light of that, we've been working with young people to develop a guided journal intervention, which helps young people process some of their thoughts and feelings and also develop ways that they can look after their own mental health under a changing world, and also to guide them into agency and action that they want to see that's in line with their values. Finally, looking at bringing together the literature on temperature and mental health in a systematic review and meta-analysis to look at all the ways that temperature has impacted mental health, as I described at the start of the interview. So yeah, trying and tackle on this on numerous fronts.
Emma Lawrence speaking there to Caroline Brogan. Well, finally, we're leaving the topic of climate change and, for now, delving into the extreme end of physics. Meet the startup that's working on quantum computers. And this time, we're not talking about the massive and rather impractical lab bench-sized giants that we often associate with such technology. Imperial physics professor Terry Rudolph is working on machines manufactured out of readily available off-the-shelf components. He's chief architect at PsiQuantum, a company he's co-founded with fellow Imperial academics and at Bristol. The company has just secured $450 million in investment and been valued at billions. Hayley Dunning is almost as surprised by the valuation as she is by the tech itself, as Terry noticed when they chatted the other day.
You sounded legitimately surprised, and I think you couldn't be as surprised as me. So what PsiQuantum is doing is they're building a quantum computer, which is a technology that people are very excited by because it hopes to solve problems that we will never be able to solve if we are restricted to just high-performance classical computing. Now, PsiQuantum's approach is a bit different to the approach that other big players like Microsoft and Google and IBM are taking. But we're very excited by our approach. We feel that it's got a very good chance of being the first approach to build a really large-scale quantum computer.
Yeah, I was interested in your approach. What makes it different?
We focused from the start on only building a machine from manufacturable components. And by manufacturable, I mean using the same tools that are used to make your laptop and your iPhone, things like this. So that's a process which is already scalable. In fact, it's the only kind of process where you can build billions of components of anything. So we sort of took the view that we're going to take that process, which is already scalable, and make it quantum. Whereas the vast majority, in fact, all other approaches are based around taking some quantum processes, some sort of esoteric physics things, and then trying to make them scalable. And so it's this sort of inverted approach, which I think is what has many people, including our investors, thankfully, excited.
So now that you've got this hearty investment, what are the next steps? What are you hoping you'll be able to achieve in the next few years?
The next steps are we will expand and we will keep pushing hard to prove out the engineering, and also the theorists in the company work very hard at sort of making the architecture simpler. Some of the company is really doing what we would think of as scientific research, and some of the company is doing what we would think of as really pure hardcore engineering. And one of the things you have to do is be able to make sure that all of these people are talking well, communicating well. And I think it's something which is quite different to even academia, which is that everyone is working on the same single goal. I had a big research group, and it always breaks up into, different projects, different sort of mini goals of different students and postdocs. At PsyQuantum, it's not like that. Everyone is working on the same goal. Everyone benefits from everyone else's success. And the key thing that we have to do is make sure everyone is communicating well so that we don't, have different subgroups head down different trajectories. But so far, I think we've been very successful.
You're making quantum computers, but you're also thinking about quantum in different ways. Recently, you published a preprint about how perhaps alien civilizations could be talking to each other with stars. And it got picked up in some papers and things like that. But it's an interesting concept, right? How might that work?
That work is really a spin-off, let's say, of the photonic quantum computing approach that we're taking. The type of quantum computer that we're building at PsyQuantum, the architecture is basically a distributed quantum computation, i.e. you can think of it as there's many different localized parties, let's say, who share quantum entanglement and do operations that you could sort of think of as a giant quantum network or quantum internet. While I was trying to understand or simplify some of the sort of esoteric quantum effects we were finding while we were designing the computer, I kind of realized that, in actual fact, you could use just the thermal light from stars as a way of distributing the entanglement that you need to do a quantum computation. And what's interesting about it is that you don't have to disturb the thermal light at all in order to do this distribution of the entanglement. So what it means is that, in principle, if you wanted to, you could take any thermal light source, a light bulb or even a star, and make a measurement on it which doesn't change the way it looks to an external observer. It would still look like a thermal light source. What this would mean if aliens really were doing this is that we would see nothing. We would just see thermal light from stars, which is exactly what we see. The logical fallacy would be, therefore the aliens are there and doing this. Obviously, we don't know that. But I thought it was an interesting possibility because, many people do wonder why it is that we don't see when we look out into the universe. Why don't we see the presence of other intelligent life? And I guess the point is, if they were very keen on staying quiet, could hide their presence from us completely. Of course, if they're that circumspect, they probably know something about what's out there in the universe that we don't, and that might be something pretty scary. So perhaps we should be a little bit quieter in the universe if that's what they're doing.
So we shouldn't be blasting all our radio waves into space.
Possibly not.
Well, that's not quite where I expected that interview to go. It's why we love doing the podcast. That's Hayley Dunning talking there to Terry Rudolph. We hope you enjoyed it. Now, that's it for this edition, but do remember to keep an eye on the website, greatexhibitionroadfestival.co.uk, for updates on the forthcoming festival. It's running from the 9th to the 15th of October, online and in situ. We just can't wait. Well, that's it for this edition. We will be back next time. In the meantime, from all of us here on the podcast team, thanks for listening and goodbye.